Now, this part we saw in chapter 1, part 1. We're going to look next here at pathogens. So I just wanted to kind of reiterate some of the terms and some of the basic starting points that we talked about before. So we're gonna look at pathogens as part of our next topic here. So we know that pathogens are microbes that cause disease, or at least that's how we defined it in part 1. But just to clarify here, really it's a type of relationship that's determined to be parasitic because it only benefits one member in the relationship and not another. So in the case of humans, these microorganisms cause harm to us in their pursuit of their own benefit. And then recall that we talked about these in reference to the body systems that they are affecting. Now, what's new, what we want to talk about from a new context, is that a pathogen can be defined in kind of two loose categories. Again, these are broad, and this is not always just, obvious as one or the other. But generally speaking, there's two pathogenic groups that we can place microbes into. So the question is then, what are these two groups and what are the differences between them? Okay, so let's take a quick look here at that. So let's start with, what are the two groups? The two groups are considered, Group 1 is considered an opportunistic pathogen. Group 2 is considered a primary pathogen. So we have, and let's put this in a plural context, opportunistic pathogens and primary pathogens. So those are your two groups. All right, now let's talk about what are the differences between them. Okay, so an opportunistic pathogen can be thought of as a pathogen that only causes harm to a host with a lowered / reduced immune system. Or you could even say immune system / immune response. So a pathogen that only causes harm to a host with a lowered / reduced immune system or immune response. And let me follow that up here. Let me just give you the other one real quick. A primary pathogen is a pathogen that only causes harm, or excuse me, let me rephrase that. A pathogen that is capable of causing harm to an individual with a healthy, sorry, my phone's going off there. Pathogen that is capable of causing harm to an individual with a healthy immune response, a healthy immune system / response. So the idea is that in one group, the opportunistic, we have a group of pathogens that are really only capable of causing any harm to an individual when the individual's immune system becomes lowered. And later in the semester, we're going to talk all about the immune system. And so this is something that we'll understand better in a greater level of detail. But as we'll learn later, our immune system is really, really, really incredible. I think it's one of the most amazing things about the human body, although the entire human body is really amazing. But the immune system certainly is no exception. Our immune system is incredibly complex. We have many levels of defense, and it's really, really tough for any microbe to cause harm to our body when our body is fully capable of fighting them off. So in other words, when you're healthy and your immune system is healthy, good luck to any microbe trying to cause harm. I mean, really. First, you look at people who really exercise and eat well and sleep well and are capable of kind of controlling their body functions with all sorts of activities and diet and exercise. They rarely ever get sick. I mean, people who are really, really healthy are just capable of fighting off almost everything. Primary pathogens are pathogens, though, that have a way of getting around our immune system. So as amazing as our immune system is, there are microbes who have adapted over time to get around it. And the idea between pathogens and their hosts is it's kind of like a game of chess. We have a defense system, and we make a move in our body. Our body kind of adapts and evolves to fight off these microbes, and the microbes adapt and evolve to kind of fight back and get around it. So over time, many microbes have evolved and adapted to be able to get around the immune system. Something that we'll be talking about in different examples throughout the semester we'll start in chapter 4 with some examples of structures that microbes have that allow them to avoid the immune system. So there are certain characteristics that primary pathogens have that allow them to kind of weave in and around the host immune defense system, so to speak. So these microbes have built-in adaptations to fight off the immune system. So even when it's healthy, they're still able to cause harm. Whereas opportunistic pathogens, they don't have these sort of built-in adaptations to the immune system. So let me just clarify that. So opportunistic pathogens, no adaptations to immune response. So when they encounter a healthy immune response, they're done. That's it. With a primary pathogen, they do have adaptations to an immune response. I'm talking about this in a general sense. So let's be clear here. Not all primary pathogens are equal. And it does matter how healthy you are. Again, I'm speaking very general. People who are super healthy and have a really strong immune system can even fight off primary pathogens to an extent. But the difference in general is that they have adaptations to get around our immune response. Or I should say, let me add to this, adaptations to avoid the immune response. Okay, so that's kind of the general difference. Opportunistics, and the term is fairly appropriate because they are opportunistic. When the opportunity presents itself for them to get around the immune system, they take advantage of it. Whereas a primary pathogen is one that, generally speaking, will take advantage of that with their adaptation against the immune system. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between the two there. So again, we're talking in very general terms. There's lots of subtle and specific differences with each pathogen. And one of the things I want to address here next in reference to that is that it's never quite as simple as we stated initially, right? We want to kind of lay down the groundwork. We want to lay down some of the fundamental rules. But the truth is it's never really that simple. There's always many, many details that complicate the true understanding of all these things. And you really have to get into specific examples. So in an introductory class like this, while we will give those examples, we're not able to cover all of them. So it's important to recognize that we are just kind of laying some foundations here. So in reference to that, it's important to recognize that pathogens will vary by host. And what that means is that the way a pathogen affects each individual is going to be different. And that includes different species. That also includes each individual within a species. So for example, two people with a slightly different genetic makeup can be exposed to the exact same pathogen under the exact same conditions at the exact same time, and each person will respond differently. One person may get sick and the other person may not get sick. And this is something that you kind of already know because you've probably seen this throughout your life. You've probably been in a room where you knew somebody was sick and maybe you got sick and someone else didn't, or vice versa. So we know that two people given the same exposure can have two different outcomes. And it's not always easy to say why that is. But again, from a general perspective, different individuals can have a different level of susceptibility. Some people have just a more genetically enhanced immune system, and other people have just from a genetic standpoint, have less of an immune system. And then it also comes down to different species in which the physiological makeup of one species can be different from another. So for example, dogs and cats and human beings can all have a very different response to the same pathogen. One of the things we'll talk about later in the semester are called zoonotic pathogens. A zoonotic pathogen is the one that's capable of transmitting from an animal to a human, and sometimes vice versa. And the idea is that while they can be shared amongst different species, each species has a slightly different response to it. So as an example, cats can carry a bacteria known to cause cat scratch fever. That's actually a real disease called cat scratch fever. And the idea is cats actually carry the pathogen that causes it without usually having any harm to them. But when they transmit that to a human, and especially in a bite wound or a scratch wound, that same bacteria that's more or less harmless to the cat can cause a significant level of damage to the human. So because our physiology and our genetic makeup is different, the response to a pathogen is also going to be different. So in a general sense, that's kind of the way that works. It's also important to point out here that while pathogens can be transferred from one species to another, sometimes they're simply just picked up from the environment. And so it's not always a matter of a pathogen interacting differently in one organism or another. Sometimes it's just a matter of an individual picking it up from the environment. In that case, it gets into the body and causes harm. But in a lot of cases, a pathogen is transferred from one organism to another. and there's a different context in which one organism gets sick and the other one doesn't. And in other cases, you simply pick up a microbe from the environment and it causes harm once it gets inside your body. Now, one of the most interesting things about some of the new information emerging is the idea that pathogens are not quite as black and white as we once thought. At one point, it was generally thought that there is a list of microbes, and these are the pathogens, and then everything else is considered not a pathogen, right? And then this black and white perspective on what a pathogen is. New research is indicating that this simplistic view is just simply not accurate, and it certainly doesn't represent the full extent to which microbes interact with their body. As an example, to illustrate this point, one of the interesting notes coming out of what's called the Human Microbiome Project, I'll mention that here shortly, is that from all the people so far that have been studied in terms of their microbial makeup, it appears that virtually all healthy people harbor known pathogens. So in other words, healthy people have been studied in these new research projects, and what they're finding is that they have harmful pathogens, or what are thought to be harmful pathogens, within their body. And this is somewhat new because, to clarify here, from a kind of a traditional microbial and microbiology standpoint, research always tended to look at sick people. So they would look at someone who's sick and they would say, "Why are you sick?" And then they would say, "Oh, here's a microbe that we can determine is making you sick, and therefore this is why you're sick," which is fine. That's a great way to study disease. But what they're now doing is that they're looking at healthy people, and there's this saying, what types of bacteria do you have in your body? What are the different species? Where are they found? How many, etc. And one of the things that they're discovering in this new kind of approach is that healthy people have known pathogens in their body, which is pretty surprising, because the idea was that, well, you don't get sick until you're exposed to the pathogen, right? I mean, you don't have the pathogen one day, and then the next day you do have the pathogen, and that's why you get sick. That's kind of the traditional view on it. Well, then around realizing that's just not really accurate. It turns out that a lot of healthy people harbor these known pathogens, and it's starting to look like really what's happening, at least in certain cases, is that your physiology is changing, or something is changing in the body that causes the relationship between the microbe and the human to change along with it. And this is an example, just to go back here, where we talked about the fact that these relationships exist on a continuum. The idea is that on one day, the microbe may be considered commensal, and the next day, for whatever reason, this is not always obvious as to why, but for some reason, it becomes parasitic. And that's kind of what this research is indicating. It's not always a matter of being exposed. It's a matter sometimes of the relationship changing within. And that's really something that people didn't even really think about until the last 10 to 15 years with new research here. It's also starting to look really, really obvious that microbes don't just make us sick. They can influence a variety of aspects of our physiology, even our behavior. I got another article that will talk about that. It looks like microbes can affect our body type, how much weight we carry, whether we have a thin or more of a heavy body type. It looks like they can potentially influence our brain behavior, appetite, mood, and probably many other things that scientists have yet to really scratch the surface on. This is really, again, kind of a new look at microbes, because while it's not necessarily, if microbes are affecting your behavior, for example, it may not necessarily be a disease, quote unquote, but there's definitely an impact there. And whether that impact is good, bad, or neutral, may be somewhat subjective, maybe somewhat of an opinion, but the idea is that they're having an impact, and it's not always obvious, and it's not always strictly from a disease standpoint. So that's, pathogens, for example, what they're finding is that pathogens may actually make some people more aggressive. they may actually make some people more sedentary. And this is very speculative. There's not a lot of really solid evidence to prove any of this, but it's a lot of kind of clues that are being pointed to in research that just needs more time to emerge. Is really what it is. We're really just in the beginning stages of all this being uncovered, and so we don't really have tons and tons of definitive evidence, but lots of anecdotal and lots of clues that are indicating that this is what's happening. So you have to kind of take that for what it is. It's not definitive, but it definitely is very interesting, and it definitely is consistent. There's a consistent view emerging that these have an impact. So that's kind of a new perspective on a pathogen. Just to clarify, I just want to point out that the traditional view is not entirely wrong. It is definitely the case that you can be exposed to a microbe and get sick as a result of that exposure. Let me just clarify. It's not always that you have a microbe from within and that it causes damage. That's just a new way of looking at it. The old way is still correct. You can still be exposed to a microbe and get sick simply from exposure. They don't always, result from some sort of change within the body. So this is really just a new way of looking at it that coexists with the old way. Part of this information is coming from a major research project that's been going on for over 10 years now called the Human Microbiome Project. With an introductory class, I'm not going to get too deep into this because I feel like this is more of an advanced topic. I just kind of want to make you aware of it, and if you're interested, you're certainly welcome to go look this up, obviously. The HMP, or the Human Microbiome Project, is something that's been funded through government research, government money, rather being provided for research. And one of the things that they set out to uncover was what impact microbes are having on our body. And so some of this research is coming through this particular project. And the idea is that they set out to look at what types of microbes were on the body, and what types of impacts they have on our body. And really a new novel approach to this, as I kind of already mentioned, was to look at people who are healthy and see what kind of microbes they have there. Not just study someone when they're sick or diseased. That's more like the traditional approach. I like to think of this, it's not just my view, this is the opinion of many experts, the idea of studying someone when they're sick and then looking for a cause of that illness is really kind of like the low-hanging fruit. And if you read through chapter 1 in the textbook, they talk about the golden era, or the golden age of microbiology, and this took place between the early 1900s and the mid to late, really up until I would say probably 1990s, 2000s, but really kind of in the 50s and 60s in that time period. They were kind of picking out all of the obvious examples of when someone gets a disease, and then they could trace that back to a microbe causing the disease. And I like, again, this is kind of like the low-hanging fruit. These are kind of like the most obvious examples of microbe impact on the human body. And so for a long time, this was just the traditional view. You get exposed, you get sick, you take a drug, an antibiotic or whatever, you fight it off and you get better. Well, the more current look, and this is from some expert testimonial, they're describing gut bacteria as a separate organ. And there's a question on the study guide about this. But the analogy, to kind of give you an idea of how impactful these microbes are, is that they're being compared as a separate organ in the body. So in other words, we have several trillion bacteria in our bodies, probably somewhere around 40 to 50 trillion, give or take. And about one bacteria for every cell in our body. In fact, it's slightly more than one bacteria per cell. So we have at least one bacteria for every cell in our body. That's at least the current view. And to clarify, at one point, and really when you look this up, if you look it up, you'll find that most sources will actually cite a 10-to-1 ratio. In other words, most sources will tell you that there's about 10 bacteria or 10 microbes for every one cell in your body. That actually, according to some of the latest research, is inaccurate. It was overstated. It's actually probably closer to a 1-to-1 relationship. But the idea is that we have just as many bacteria as we have our own cells. And the idea is that with that sheer number of bacteria, their impact can be really compared to a separate organ in the body. Just an organ that is non-traditional, an organ that is constantly changing, a very dynamic organ, and an organ that is not the same in every person. So that analogy is somewhat loose. That's why I put it in quotes. It's not like some sort of static, definitive thing. But to give you an idea of what kind of impact we're talking about here, you can think of these bacteria as like an organ in the body, one that's just very different from any other organ. And really an organ that's not of ourself. So kind of a weird way to think about these microbes. But again, that's kind of from the experts who study this. They're saying that that's the kind of impact that these microbes have. It's like a separate organ. Now, the truth is, this impact is as I just mentioned, it's not obvious. It's not always the same. And so one of the things complicating this study is the fact that we have each of us as individuals have a different makeup of microbes. And in fact, they say that each individual has a different makeup of microbes, kind of like we each have a different fingerprint. And the exact quantity and the exact species and the diversity of those species is a lot like a fingerprint, and where it's not really the same. It's similar in each person, but not exactly the same. Now, unlike a fingerprint, it actually changes, which makes it even more complicated. Some of the things that have an impact on the change in our microbiota, is, for example, what we eat. This apparently has a pretty big impact. Foods that we eat have a direct impact on the microbes in our colon, our large intestine. As we eat certain foods, that favors certain microbes and not others, and this can ultimately culture a different set of bacteria and kind of upregulate one set of species and downregulate another set of species. Antibiotics and other medications, certainly antibiotics, have probably the most immediate and the most obvious impact. Antibiotics, as I probably don't have to tell you, but just to clarify, antibiotics are a drug that kills bacteria. Bacteria are one of the most significant symbiotic microbes in our body. These are the dominant species in our gut, for example. When we take antibiotics because we're sick, presumably, we don't only just kill the bad bacteria, the ones that make you sick. We indirectly end up killing good bacteria as well. And again, it's something that most people are familiar with. But this has a significant impact on our gut bacteria. And taking antibiotics is now something that should be viewed with great skepticism. In other words, you shouldn't take antibiotics unless you feel like you absolutely need to. The traditional view to antibiotics, going back to the, again, mid-1900s, was take them just to be safe. Even if it may be viral, just to clarify, a viral infection is not affected by antibiotics directly. But the traditional view is go ahead and take antibiotics anyway, just to cover all your bases. Now they're looking at that as that's really not a good idea. Antibiotics definitely should be taken if you're sick. I mean, if you have a direct case to take them, then you should take them. But they should be taken with skepticism, because they will wipe out your gut bacteria. They will have a dramatic impact on the microbes in your body. And we know that these microbes are significant. And so we don't really want to be affecting these microbes unless we have to. And that's the way that the current view on antibiotics is held. Take them only when absolutely necessary, and don't just take them because you feel like that. Don't take it as a way to just kind of cover all your bases, so to speak. So the food we eat, drugs that we take, and then lastly, the people and animals and the environments that we come in contact with. As we mentioned earlier, microbes are ubiquitous. We mentioned that in Chapter 1, Part 1. So they're everywhere. So everywhere you go, you're going to be exposed to new microbes. Now, we'll talk about this in more detail. In most cases, exposure isn't necessarily going to change your entire microbial makeup, but it certainly can, and there are certainly situations where that does happen. So this is probably the least impactful of the three here. But certainly the environments that you work in, the people that you associate with, especially like close family members, they've shown, for example, that people and their pets tend to share the same types of bacteria. If your dogs, for example, if you have dogs or even cats, they've done studies on people who have dogs, and they found that they tend to share some of the same types of skin bacteria. So you share some of your bacteria with your animal, and your animal shares some of its bacteria with you. I've yet to read anything about the impact of that. I've yet to hear whether that's good or bad or neutral. But from what all I've read is that they've shown that there is a kind of an exchange there. So that's just one quick example. People, someone that you're intimate with, your significant other, will certainly be someone that you exchange bacteria with. So these types of things have a big impact, or at least it can have a big impact on your microbial makeup. Part of the other thing that's important to recognize here, microbes have a short lifespan. We'll talk about this in more detail later. I've said that a lot, but that's lots more to come on this. But microbes don't live very long. We're talking a matter of days, maybe weeks, and at the longest. But they're constantly regenerating themselves. So they replicate very rapidly. In fact, many microbes will replicate every so many minutes to hours. We're talking maybe every half hour to every so many hours, depending on the species and the environment. They will replicate. So their lifespan is relatively short. So what that means is that they are going to be impacted in a very short-term way. The types of food you eat, for example, as I mentioned, will upregulate one species and potentially downregulate another species. So if you're eating, for example, lots of sugar and very little fiber, research shows that you're going to kind of upregulate one set of species and downregulate another set of species. And then the opposite is true if you're eating lots of fiber. If you're eating lots of fiber, you're going to upregulate one species and downregulate another. So because they have a short lifespan, they're really impacted by the short-term things that you do in everyday life: food, impact, interaction with other medications, things like that. So that's actually good news and bad news. It's bad news because if you're not aware of it, then you're going to be having sometimes a negative impact on these microbes, and bad decisions can lead to a bad gut bacteria. It's good news because that means that you can actually change it with a directed approach. Things like probiotics, a good diet, can, within a relatively short period of time, I'm talking months, can upregulate good bacteria and downregulate bad bacteria. So there's good and bad in that.